Everybody hear me? Oh, good. Thank you very much for the honour of being here today and receiving this reward. It really is making a big difference to our work. And I'm just going to present to you a bit more about the species I'm working on, because I'm sure many of you haven't had the opportunity to see a dugong in the wild or even in captivity. So I'll start with a bit of information about this creature that has led to the legend of the mermaid across the world. Dugongs are actually called sea cows or sea pigs in many languages around the world, and that's because as they feed, they root up the seagrasses, as you can see from this picture, rather like a pig does when it's rooting around for food. They're also air-breathing mammals, so they must surface to breathe, and they're most closely related to elephants, which is actually quite a surprising fact for most people. They have a huge range from Vanuatu in the Pacific Island region through to East Africa, and they're listed as vulnerable to extinction throughout their range by the World Conservation Union. They're herbivores and they only feed on seagrasses, so it really ties them directly to this one source of food. And they live in shallow coastal waters where they often come into contact with human beings. So you can see on this map all the red areas, that shows the distribution of dugongs across the world. And as you can see, it is quite a large range, but that can be deceptive. There are not many dugongs left, despite the fact that they used to be very numerous across this whole part of the world. And dugongs can grow to 3 meters in length and weigh up to 400 kilograms. So that presents humans with a really good opportunity for meat, and a large quantity of meat as well, if they do encounter them. And they can live up to or longer than 70 years. We're not sure exactly how long the longest dugong has ever lived for, but it is a long time and comparable to humans. The sad thing is that they don't reach reproductive age until sometimes around 17 years old, so there's an awful long time to wait for the dugong to survive before it can produce its first calf. And when they have a calf, they usually only have one calf, and it's a lot of investment. The female is pregnant for 13 months, and after this time, the calf will stay with the mother for a year and a half, and it needs to suckle from the mother and then gradually learn to eat seagrasses. So there's a huge investment in terms of maternal care for dugongs. There's also a great number of legends and myths associated with this creature, not just the mermaid myth. So I think that's really fascinating part of the dugong, is that people relate to them all across the world, and they actually draw parallels with human beings because of the fact that they do nurture their young rather like humans do. And apparently a female dugong looks rather like a woman to sailors who've been at sea for a rather long time. So unfortunately I'm going to now show you some pictures of dead dugongs and explain why they're endangered today. We've had a lot of hunting dugongs in the past, and particularly with the advent of motorised vessels in the 1960s across their entire range, it became very easy for humans to exploit them. Thousands of years ago they were indeed exploited, but people were generally in outrigger canoes, and dugongs can move quite fast compared to people paddling canoes. So people had to be very skillful fishers indeed, and there had to be a team of people involved in killing these animals. But in recent years it's very easy for anybody to go out to chase them down and to exhaust them and spear them. We also have the issue of accidental capture in fishing nets, and as our fisheries expand, particularly artisanal, small-scale coastal fisheries, they're expanding in line with this huge population growth of human beings and putting a huge pressure on dugongs as they encounter nets and get tangled up, cannot come to the surface to breathe, and drown. So actually, despite past hunting, now the biggest threat is their capture in gill nets. We also unfortunately have other threats facing them, such as coastal development. In areas where hotels are being built, often seagrass is removed because people don't want seagrasses. They want a nice sandy bottom for tourists to swim on. And also just general dredging and activities like that have disturbed seagrass habitat. We also have the issue of deforestation, so there's also linked activities on land, because when we cut down forests, sediments wash down into the seas, and the seagrass is the first shallow water environment to be hit. And obviously being plants, they require light to survive. So by having cloudy, murky waters, seagrass dies off. And this is the threat, being the only source of food for dugongs. I've actually been focusing much of my work recently in the Western Indian Ocean region. So I've put up a map here for those of you who are not so familiar with the region. And they really are in trouble here. Compared to Australia, where there's a population of around 40,000 dugongs left, in the Western Indian Ocean, the largest populations we know of are 200 to 300 animals off the Mozambique coast. Throughout Tanzania and Kenya, it's very, very rare now to see a dugong on the coast. And Madagascar and Comores, we hardly know anything about them. This is the work we've been doing, is really trying to find out where they live and take actions to conserve them. So it's quite challenging really, because we're dealing with really small populations and we need to collect data on them. How can we conserve them if we don't know where they are and where they're feeding and where the fisheries pressures are the greatest? So it's also really hard because these countries, most people are living below the poverty line in coastal areas, Madagascar, particularly remote villages, and in the Comores. And to really impress the importance on people of species conservation is difficult when they need to put food on their plates on a daily basis. They have poor access to health and to education. And we're also working with an animal that's shy. A dugong is not like a dolphin or a whale. We can't go out in boats and hope that we'll make observations, because dugongs shy away from boats. As soon as they hear any kind of human activity in the water, they will swim deeper down and disappear out of sight. So it's really quite challenging. We can't have much direct observation. We also have to deal with many, many languages across the areas in which we're working with fishers, because, for example, in Madagascar, there are several dialects in all the areas we work. So we've got to come across these language barriers and make sure we get accurate information. And we're also dealing with political issues. There's not necessarily much political will in many of these countries to take action for marine species. And we have no data in most places on the fisheries. So we don't know how many boats are operating out of a particular village, and we don't know what gear is being used and how that's changing over time. So we have to gather this data now. So to face up to these challenges, we've come up with an approach where we look at various different factors. We start with interviewing knowledgeable fishers, and not just older fishers who've been catching fish for 50, 60 years, but also with young fishermen, and asking them about their observations of dugongs, when and where they've been seeing these animals. And we also get into the water and map seagrasses. They're quite shallow in general, so we can go by snorkel and create maps of seagrass areas, and we can also observe areas where dugongs have fed because they've rooted up the seagrass. And we like to combine with our approach education and feedback. It's really important when we're working in remote villages as scientists to give information to the communities, tell them why we're there, explain about the animal's ecology and why it's disappearing, because often people think they're becoming few and far between because they've just swum away somewhere else. They don't like it here anymore. They don't see the bigger picture and realise that the animal's at threat in the whole region. And we've also been focusing on training, because without young people on the ground who can continue this work and actually continue to gather data over a long period of time and continue to educate, we will be wasting our time. So we've done a lot of training in terms of local people, rangers that work for the government departments, and also university students. Using this approach, we come up with dugong conservation hotspots. As we all know, there's very limited conservation funding to go around, and we need to make the best use of it. So we find the areas where there's important dugong habitats and where they are most under threat, and where they're also most frequently observed these days, so that we can focus in on those areas. And fortunately, our methods have been recognised internationally now by the Convention on Migratory Species, and they've wanted to develop an international standardised questionnaire, because they recognise we really need to gather data on dugongs, not only in the Western Indian Ocean region, but throughout the world, and we need to do it rapidly. We need to, in some cases, be taking action tomorrow, because these creatures will be extinct in 20, 30 years, potentially in some countries. So they've adopted part of our questionnaire into this internationally standardised one. We've also given policy briefs to governments of the Comores and Madagascar so they can make decisions about dugongs when they're planning for marine protected areas, for example. And I think one of the things that really interests me is the greater awareness that has come about in the coastal communities. So we always evaluate our awareness campaigns and find out, did people learn more and what's their level of knowledge, and seeing that increase and people's concern increases with their understanding of the issue. We also had the first technical meeting for dugongs in the region, so that's great. It's brought together loads of government people and NGOs who will take action. And in the future, with the Future for Nature Award, we're really going to be focusing on protecting key dugong habitat in northern Madagascar. We have the hotspots now, and now we need to go and take action. We need to reduce mortality in fishing nets and deliberate hunting as well. And we need to come up with benefits for the communities. They need to see what the benefits of a dugong are. For example, the fact that dugongs replenish the seagrass system and keep their local fisheries healthy is important. But then again, people don't think long term. They need to see benefits today. So we're going to be working on the environmental mortgages approach, which has been developed by colleagues at Advanced Conservation Strategies. And together with their knowledge, we're going to implement this theory. And that is to have a trade between the community, linking their good marine stewardship in certain areas for particular species, for example, with key benefits that they will receive in return for this performance. So monitoring those effects means we can then bring in the healthcare experts, bring in education experts, or whatever their requirements are, in return for them conserving an area, which will no doubt help many other species as well as their fisheries, not just the dugong. So I hope we can work together over the next few years to help save this really fascinating animal that has led to the legend of the mermaid and make sure that it doesn't go extinct. I'd like to thank everybody at Future for Nature and all our sponsors and supporters in the past, as well as our communities we're working with and staff and volunteers, because they've really all come together to make this a very successful programme. Thank you.